Harry Stack Sullivan defined personality as the recurrent pattern of interpersonal situations that characterize a life. But what is an interpersonal situation? My colleague Aaron Pincus and I, along with our friends, have been trying to formalize this concept to enable research and practice from the interpersonal tradition. And when we think about what the interpersonal situation is, we ask a question that goes like, if you were watching two people interact, or if you were in an interaction and you stop the tape, you stop time, what would you need to know what's really happening between those two people? Is there a series of questions that if you had the answers to, you'd feel like I have a pretty good grip on everything that's important about this interaction or this interpersonal situation? And we think that there are 8 questions that you could answer. And if you had those answers, then you would know what's happening. The first is, what's the other person doing and what am I doing? Second is, how does the other person feel and how do I feel? The third is, what does that other person want and what do I want? And the fourth set of questions are, how am I seeing this situation in a way that's maybe different than others would, and how are they seeing the situation in a way that others would? So these sets of questions correspond to different systems of the interpersonal situation. There's the behavioral system, what are people doing? The affect system, how are people feeling? The self system, what do people want? And the perception system, how are people seeing things? And so this picture is an attempt to formalize those different systems and the dimensions within each of them. The behavior system is something that happens between the two people, the self and the other. And it's structured by dominance and warmth, the 2 dimensions of the interpersonal circumplex. So people can vary in how dominant they're being and how warm they're being. And generally speaking, when you plot two people's behavior on the interpersonal circle, you expect complementarity patterns, right? So if I'm dominant, you'll be submissive. If I'm warm, you'll be warm, and vice versa. The self system is also organized around the interpersonal circumplex, but rather than focusing on dominant versus warm behaviors, it focuses on agentic versus communal goals. So, do I want to be in control or do I want you to take charge? Do I want to be close to you or do I want to be more distant from you? Because both the self and behavior systems are circles, blends of agency and communion or dominance and warmth are possible. Do I want to teach you by being both agentic and communal at the same time? Do I want to withdraw from you by being low in agency and low in communion at the same time? The affect system is structured by arousal and valence, where arousal is how much emotion does the person feel, and valence is what is the flavor of that emotion? Is it good versus bad? So a high arousal, high valence emotion might be something like happiness or excitement, whereas a high arousal, low valence emotion might be something like anger. A low arousal, low valence emotion might be something like depression. Now, you could use a discrete model of emotions like depression, anxiety, anger, etc. You could also use a different 2 dimensional model like the positive and negative affect system. It's not super important which particular model you use in this case. I find that arousal and valence is something that I can easily keep track of in the moment. So I prefer that one. Now, there's a double-headed arrow between the self system and the affect system because affects drive what we want. And conversely, affects are also communicating to us whether we're getting what we want. And so within both the self and the other, there's a tight linkage between how people feel and their goal satisfaction versus frustration. Finally, in the top and the middle, there's the perception system. The horizontal arrows are about how the self perceives the other and the other perceives the self. For example, I might think that you want to get close to me, but actually you want to manipulate me or take advantage of me in some way. So I could misperceive you and vice versa. And the curved arrows reflect self-insight. Am I aware of how I'm feeling? Am I aware of what I want? Am I aware of how my behavior comes across to other people? We developed this model in part as we were thinking about training psychotherapy students, where we would perceive that when you're doing psychotherapy, there's so much going on and it all comes at you so quickly, and you can't just stop the tape and think about what you would like to do. And so it helps to have a model that you can internalize and learn, and that you can develop a formulation about patience with so that when those moments come where it feels like you should do something important, you can do it in a principled way based on a very quick assessment of those 8 questions. How is the other person feeling and how am I feeling? What are they doing? What am I doing? What do they want? What do I want? And how are we seeing things relative to the way an objective observer might? Now, this picture looks complicated the first time that you look at it, and that is because it's an effort to balance a number of different competing concerns. The first, the first domain we try to balance is between evidence-based measurement and subjective experience. So on the one hand, all of the variables in this model are coupled with evidence-based measurement tools, both questionnaires to assess dispositions, but also dynamic assessment tools that can be used in ambulatory or observational designs. And yet they work together in a coordinated way to capture the experiential features of interpersonal situations. For that reason, you can use the interpersonal situation model to organize both research and practice. As I said, when you're doing psychotherapy, it's helpful to think about these questions, and the interpersonal situation model provides an organized framework for thinking about what's the other person doing, how am I feeling, etc. On the other hand, it's also a model that can be used to couple different variables in research. It's unlikely that all the variables in this model would be coupled in the same study, but many ambulatory studies, for example, measure both what people are doing and how they're feeling using two-dimensional models like the ones in the interpersonal situation. When it comes to capturing the interpersonal situation, there's a real balance between, on the one hand, accounting for all of the most important questions and the variables that you would need in order to answer those questions, like what are you doing? What do you want? How are you feeling? And on the other hand, being easy enough to remember. And we think the interpersonal situation does a reasonable job of balancing these two concerns. Now, of course, you can have more specific goals than agency and communion. You can have more specific feelings, etc. So it's not as comprehensive as it could be, but making it more comprehensive would make it more difficult to remember. And of course, it takes a little while to really remember this model and to try to internalize it so that you can use it in day-to-day interactions. On the other hand, if you made it more memorable by making it simpler, then you would lose important information and it would be less comprehensive. So we sought to balance these two competing concerns in developing this model. And finally, the interpersonal situation can both provide a static portrait of what a person is like, but it can also depict dynamic processes, right? So I can say, this is a person who generally has high agency, low communion motives, who tends to be aggressive behaviorally, who tends to feel a lot of high arousal, low valence emotions, who tends to misperceive themselves. So you can describe a kind of what a person is like in general, but you can also describe dynamic processes. When this person perceives others' motives in a certain way, it causes them to feel a certain way, which then triggers a motive and thus a behavior. That behavior then triggers a behavior in the other person, which are coupled with thoughts and desires, etc. And so oftentimes when you're making a formulation in psychotherapy, it's important to try to make a dynamic formulation about how do interpersonal situations play out over time, which goes beyond a static portrait. As an example, Aaron Pincus and I published a paper in 2012 in which we described a client who approached interpersonal situations or the psychotherapy context in particular, feeling content because they sort of saw the other person as in a warm, dominant kind of leading position, and they saw themselves in a kind of warm, submissive, complementary following position. Now, you'll notice here, I don't have goals or perceptions explicitly in this image. Sometimes it helps when depicting dynamic processes to focus on certain aspects of the interpersonal situation model. And it's flexible. You can do that as the situation sort of indicates. So in this case, we have affect and we have behavior, but perception is also implicit because this person's perception of the therapist is what really counts. Whether the therapist is intending to be warm and dominant or is objectively behaving warm and dominant is less important than from this patient's perspective, the therapist was in the warm dominant position and that made her feel content. But that stage would quickly give way to a second stage in which she would perceive the therapist becoming cold, withdrawing, not paying attention, not being empathically in tune with her. And that would make her anxious. She would start worrying about, what's going on? Why are you losing interest? What is it about me that makes you uninterested? And this anxiety would quickly turn to anger. She would say, why aren't you paying attention to me? I come here, I pay you to be my therapist. I'm disclosing very personal stuff, and it's like you don't even care to listen. And in the case study, we illustrated how this interpersonal situation plays out in a way that gives the therapist a choice for either a more or less therapeutic behavior. This pattern was remarkable because early on in this interaction, when the therapist was caught off guard, they would respond with an interpretation. They would say something like, I see. So you're angry with me because you feel like I'm not paying attention. This reminds me of another story you told about another person. And that interpretation was perceived by the patient as a cold dominant maneuver, sort of taking the status back from her. So she tried to express her anger, and the therapist responds by being dominant, by sort of putting her in her place with an interpretation in which he then had more control. And indeed, and upon reflection, the therapist thought, well, maybe part of the reason that I did interpret was because I was feeling anxious by her being suddenly angry with me in a way that I wasn't anticipating, and I was trying to regulate my anxiety by taking more control. The problem is that this led to a fourth stage in which there was a return to complementarity, but now on the cold side. Now the therapist was the cold, dominant, aggressive other who was not concerned with the patient's well-being, but was more concerned with being in control. And the client was now in a cold, submissive, withdrawing position. And of course, this cold complementarity dynamic was the very problem, and the sadness that accompanies that is the very problem that the patient presented with in the first place. And so this left the therapist feeling as though they were more part of the problem than the solution. And so the interpersonal situation model helps depict how this pattern comes to pass and also gives the therapist some ideas about how they could address it in a way that would be therapeutic rather than counter-therapeutic. In the first stage, neutrality might be important. Avoid the dominant position and the idea that when um, I'm sort of in the room as the therapist, that I'm the one who's in charge. Elevate the patient's sense of dominance and agency, and by decreasing the therapist's sense of dominance and agency. In the second stage, be on the lookout for evidence that maybe the client is feeling as though the therapist is not paying enough attention. Now, sometimes it might really be the case that the therapist is not paying attention. Other times, this might be a perception by the client. Again, it's not that important. What's important in this case is what's psychologically real for the client, not what might be objectively happening. So be on the lookout for moments when the client might be perceiving the therapist as not interested or not paying enough attention. Perhaps most importantly, if it gets to the third stage where the client is saying, why aren't you listening to me? I'm angry with you. Rather than interpret, try to stay present and empathic. How must that feel to come here to disclose everything and then feel as though your therapist isn't even bothering to pay attention for you, rather than this reminds me of a time with another person, right? To avoid getting to this fourth stage where you've replicated the kind of problem that the patient presented with in the first place, where there's cold complementarity coupled with a sense of hopelessness or sadness or the feeling that people don't care about me, right? So at each stage of this process, if you can break it down using the interpersonal situation model, there's specific time-sensitive interventions that might be appropriate in order to make use of the process. Moreover, by having a kind of comprehensive picture of how this process plays out, it's easier to have a meta communication with the client about, this is what I sort of notice that keeps happening between us. We start here, we go here, and then we end up here. This might be a time in a lowered affective state where it would be appropriate to say, and this pattern also plays out in other relationships in your life. So this is one example of how a dynamic interpretation of the interpersonal situation components can be useful for therapy. The interpersonal situation is a general model of behavior that is intended to account for all the important stuff that's happening in interpersonal situations. See you next time.